Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show.
Hi Julia, how's your week been?
Hey Laura, my week's been going really well, thank you. I've been busy preparing for a webinar that I'm hosting for The Grocer in July. It's all about online grocery after COVID, and it's got some really interesting speakers, including from Waitrose and Uber Eats. So I'm busy preparing for that. Actually, I will put a link in the show notes as well. So if you're listening to this and you're interested in online grocery and how it's going to develop after the pandemic, you might very well want to give that a listen. How's your week been?
Yeah, good week, thank you. And I've signed up for your webinar, so I'll be in the good books. I've been finalising a global report for the amount of women that are working in the meat sector. As part of my role of chairing Meat Business Women, we've realised that we haven't got any data on how many women work in the sector across the territories that we operate. So we've commissioned a piece of primary research which will present in October at our next conference. So it's really exciting to see the first cut of data coming out of that, and it'll be really interesting to the meat sector, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I can't wait to hear you talk about some of those figures. As you say, it's that primary research that's really important just to understand what sort of scale of challenge you're even dealing with. So yeah, very excited to hear that's getting underway.
So we're on week 10 of the pick list. I don't know how that's happened, but we've blinked and we've done it. So we're in double figures already. And we've got some fantastic articles this week, haven't we?
We do. So my first pick this week is from Quartz, and it's part of a series of interviews they have done with key figures in all sorts of industry sectors about coronavirus and the impact that's had on their particular sector. The one that caught my eye in particular, partly because of that webinar that I'm working on, is an interview called Soren Bjorn Says Online Grocery Shopping is Here to Stay. Soren Bjorn is the president of Driscolls, the fresh berry supplier. Their headquarter is in the US, but they have operations here in the UK, and they're a major supplier of berries to major UK supermarkets as well. So why does Soren Bjorn think online grocery is here to stay? Or in particular, why does he think some of the increased levels of online grocery shopping we've been seeing as a result of the pandemic are here to stay? And he's putting forward a few quite interesting arguments. At the heart, what he's saying is that we're seeing a shift in consumer attitudes around buying fresh produce in particular. He seems to think that a big barrier to adoption previously was around those fresh categories. Consumers just didn't really trust the process that much. They liked being able to see exactly which apple you might get or which punnet of berries. And now they, in many cases, had to buy online. Many people have tried online grocery because it's become the only or the most convenient option for them. And by and large, he says, consumer experience seems to have been pretty good on fresh produce. So that's starting to dispel some of those concerns that people may have had. And he also thinks that that could have a really interesting knock-on effect, not just on online grocery and the sorts of adoption levels we're likely to see in the future, but in also totally unrelated areas. He talks about the impact on packaging, for example. Berries, punnets typically tend to be plastic punnets. And one of the reasons for that is that people like seeing the berries before they buy them. But if you're now increasingly buying online where you don't see the particular punnet that you're buying anyway, might there be less of a need for some of that plastic packaging? And is that potentially going to accelerate moves away from plastic packaging in sectors like berries and sectors like fresh produce more generally? He also raises an interesting point about branding. And I think this is about produce, berries, as much as other parts of the fresh category. He reckons if you have more people buying online, different points of differentiation might become more important. As we know, fresh produce is pretty much own label through and through, very few brands. But if you have more consumers buying online, having a brand actually becomes something quite tangible that makes sense in an online environment and might actually help to reassure consumers about some of those concerns about, not being able to pick the exact punnet or knowing exactly which bit of produce is going to be picked for you. So I think it's a really interesting point, and it immediately made me think of you and your work with the meat industry, because of course meat does also face similar challenges around high levels of own label. It's really quite tough to develop strong brands around primary produce. Is that shift to online grocery shopping potentially going to make it a little bit easier for meat suppliers to push branding as well?
What really struck me about the article was all about trust, wasn't it? And actually, we've had this issue about trust, as you say, because people have been concerned about being able to pick the steak that they want or the berries that they want because they haven't had that eyes on online before. But it makes me think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That bottom couple of layers have been stripped out during the pandemic, and actually I just want to feed my family, and I don't mind if there's that I don't get to see those berries beforehand, or I don't get to hand select my steak. And actually now people have tried that through maybe something that they wouldn't have done naturally, and through force rather than choice. Actually they're now comfortable with it, and that's really interesting. And I think packaging has been the salesman on the shelf. When I did my marketing degree, we did a whole chunk of content on packaging, but that's so different now, isn't it? And as you say, the salesman on the shelf for packaging will be the case for online, and it needs to be a stronger, probably branded proposition. And what does that mean for the packaging that it comes in? And you think for the meat sector in particular, to get into skin pack took quite a long time, and there was concerns about would consumers like that because of the discoloration on the meat. But that would be a huge opportunity for even more products to be probably in a longer life packaging, because it doesn't really matter what it looks like, because it's coming out of a dark store and the branding's all about what's online, as long as there's maybe good cooking recipe information when the product comes.
Totally. And I think the point you make about packaging is well made. You do wonder whether, with that shift towards online, whether packaging is going to be even more about performance more than necessarily aesthetic, and what that means for the kinds of packaging materials that we're going to see. I would expect we're going to start seeing suppliers think much harder about having packaging options that are optimized for e-commerce.
And I wonder, when you talk that through about, I like that performance over aesthetics, and we've spoken about it on previous shows, haven't we? For example, Tesco are still picking a lot of their online orders in store. So until they go to dark stores, or until they're through a regional distribution centre or whatever they may be doing, then I guess suppliers won't want to run too necessarily, unless it's a high volume item. So it'll be a bit chicken and egg, won't it? And depending on how that product is picked.
I guess at some point there's going to be a tipping point where optimizing for e-commerce is going to become important enough that it's worth the investment and worth the complexity for suppliers. And judging by what someone like Soren Bjorn is saying, I mean, he certainly seems to be confident that what we have gone through and the way consumer behavior has shifted in response to the pandemic may well be a tipping point of some sort. What's your first pick for us this week?
So my first pick is from the Wall Street Journal, and it's why the American consumer has fewer choices, maybe for good. And this is a quite a long read, but a really enjoyable one, talking through how ranges have been rationalised, as we know, in the wake of the pandemic, but looking through the United States lens. So it gives some really interesting stats, and the first one of which is the average number of different items sold was down 7.3% over the weeks ending June the 13th, Nielsen are saying, for the US. And some categories such as baby care, bakery, meat fell as much as 30% earlier in the pandemic. And as we know, a lot of retailers did rationalise their range, and encouraged by the supply base as well to keep shelves stocked with key items. But what the article does, it goes through in a little bit more detail actually. Have we been tried to be too much to all consumers? So one of the examples it gives is PepsiCo, for example, and it said the company stopped producing a fifth of its products during the COVID-19 crisis, including lightly salted Lay's potatoes. Big fan of them. And then he said him and his colleagues spoke to grocery executives as the pandemic deepened, determining that PepsiCo would focus on its fastest selling products. And then it goes on to say that actually this is now an opportunity to discontinue some of those items. And he also says there are some no regret moves. So this is Steve Williams, CEO of PepsiCo. So it's giving some of these FMCG companies permission to stop some of this range extension that they've done to a huge amount over the years, to try and please retailers, to try and keep the shelf space and fixture category going, and in actually have they tried to go too far. There's further examples in the article which I really enjoyed, and it said, for example, in 2018 the average US food retailer stocked about 33,000 different items, which is probably quite comparable with a Tesco or a JS here, compared to roughly 9,000 in 1975 according to the Food Industry Association. And Walmart Inc. supercenters typically stock 120,000 items. It's just phenomenal, isn't it? You think all these different range extensions and a good one, and you think, well, we want choice, don't we? And you know, it's nice depending on if you've got maybe a dietary requirement or something that you particularly want from a range. But one thing I think maybe has gone a bridge too far is toilet tissue. And as we know, that was under huge demand at the beginning of the pandemic, and the article pulls that out, and it says some IGA Inc. grocery stores now offer only 4 choices of toilet paper. A few months ago, before the coronavirus pandemic, IGA's 11,000 US stores typically stocked 40 varieties. So this is now giving the actually chance to stop stocking some of those, and also for retailers to take a stronger view on what they want in their ranges going forwards. And the article goes on to say this isn't just retail, and it's going into food service too. Some of the food service outlets that have remained open in the US have knocked back their ranges by 40%. And McDonald's, for example, told franchise owners this month that it would keep dozens of items, including salads, bagels, off US menus for now. And I think, you know, consumer choice, we've accepted that there's going to be less of it. And I think consumers, as you know, they're happy to be fed and happy to be able to get something to feed their family with. And we've spoken about previous shows about being able to cook differently and with different cuts of meat, for example. And Tyson had mentioned in the article, you know, because of closures that we've seen in the US plants in particular, that they haven't been able to keep the levels of throughput going. But is this here to stay? And Wall Street Journal is saying, yeah, it could be, and consumers will accept it. What are your thoughts, and how important is choice now and going forwards, do you think?
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting article. I'm really torn on this. I don't quite know what I make of it, because I think it's so difficult to get a proper sense of whether this acceptance of less choice is going to be a permanent change in consumer expectations and consumer behaviour, or whether that is still very much tied to what we have gone through and experienced during the pandemic. It obviously makes absolute sense for retailers and suppliers to have rationalised their ranges in the light of the pandemic. And absolutely, I would expect some suppliers and food service outlets to look at the products they normally offer and say, is this actually an opportunity for us to kind of take stock and maybe look at how viable some of those product extensions are. At the same time, particularly with the move to more online shopping that we've just talked about as well. I mean, that is a channel that is very much geared towards increased choice. The whole idea here is that you are sort of no longer operating within the constraints of a store, no matter how large, but that you can offer that long tail of products. I mean, that's obviously the Amazon model. So I don't know how we're going to see those sort of two different impulses reconciled in practice.
And it'll be interesting to see how that rolls out into food service. The article touches on it, but as the UK opens restaurants and pubs this weekend, if you're going out for a meal, would you anticipate to see a rationalised menu? But, is it realistic for outlets to be stocking a full range when they're going to be socially distanced in terms of number of covers in their outlet, and to hold all of that stock and to pay for all that stock? It's a big ask. So maybe across two channels we'll get used to seeing less, and as you say, online we'll get the same. Tell me what your second pick is.
So my second pick this week is from the New Yorker. It's called Our Ghost Kitchen Future. It touches a little bit on some of the themes that we've already talked about in terms of moves to online shopping behaviour or online buying and implications around choice. This is a piece written by Anna Wiener. And as the title suggests, it's an in-depth exploration of ghost kitchens. Ghost kitchens, they're also called dark kitchens, sometimes are kitchens that prepare food exclusively for delivery. So they're fully equipped kitchen facilities, typically provided by delivery services such as Deliveroo or Uber Eats, that are then leased to chefs and restaurant brands who then use those facilities to produce food for delivery customers. Dark kitchens or ghost kitchens were a sort of emerging but fairly marginal business model before the pandemic, but they are becoming more important. They're gaining traction fast, particularly with people not eating out so much. I mean, as this article points out, during the lockdown, every restaurant that was still operating in some way was a dark kitchen of some description. So what does that mean for the future of the restaurant trade? And what the article does essentially is looking at the impact this rise of dark kitchens has had on the US restaurant scenes in various cities, and also the impact that's had on local communities. Because there is a decent amount of controversy around the rise in food delivery, and particularly the rise in dark kitchens. There's one example that's cited in the article, which is a sort of fairly alarming incident where a renowned San Francisco restaurant found that an imposter was offering food under their name for delivery through a dark kitchen. They had no idea. They weren't offering anything for delivery, and someone else had managed to get their brand, their restaurant, listed on an app and was very happily selling food under their name. So obviously very disconcerting, big implications for brand reputation as well. But also it sort of flashed out an argument about the power balance between these massive delivery platforms that operate these dark kitchens and restaurant owners. How do you, as an individual restaurant, even take action against something like that? How do you make sure that your brand is protected when you're one of thousands of brands and virtual brands on these platforms? Service fees, service charges charged to restaurant owners, also a notoriously dicey issue there. There is also some increasing concern about the social impact of dark kitchens. Are they potentially pushing out local businesses? Are they separating us from that social aspect of eating out and going to restaurants? And also, what are the working conditions in some of those kitchens? On the other hand, they also speak to quite a few restaurant owners and chefs and small businesses that, have really seen fantastic benefits from embracing dark kitchens and being on these platforms. It massively lowers the barriers to entry. If you're an up-and-coming chef, if you're a hospitality entrepreneur, And you can now have a presence, and you can build a brand, and you can deliver food to your customers, and build up a customer base without needing to take on the investment and the risk of having a brick and mortar presence on the high street. I mean, that's a huge potential advantage, particularly in the current climate. And they also speak to quite a few established restaurant operators and restaurant owners who have really enjoyed the opportunities afforded by those virtual brands. They've used them as extensions of their existing brand. They've used them to sort of test new concepts, experiment with, reaching slightly different customer groups. So, there are definitely opportunities to be had as well. What did you make of it?
I remember when this first sort of became a thing, there was quite a few exposés, wasn't there, about, it's been branded as X, but it's actually not coming from the restaurant itself, and it's coming from a container in the car park, or from somewhere totally different. And the article says, many brands can be coming from the same dark kitchen. So I think it is very interesting, and I think it all comes back to quality and transparency for you consumers, because as we know, you'll get them once on the brand name or on the concept, but you won't get them coming back again and again if they're not clear on where it's actually coming from, and if it's value for money. And as you say, it's been really interesting to see some of these outlets and restaurants innovate over the COVID period, and technically the ones that have opened have become dark kitchens, and it would be nice to see them hanging on to some of that trade. But it's always that last mile, or more, in terms of distribution. How did they do that efficiently without killing the margins?
What's your second pick this week?
My second pick this week is from Food Manufacture, and it's Consumers Go Local as food purchasing changes due to the pandemic. And this is an article all talking about the Food Standards Agency report, which was just released last week. And the FSA, working with Ipsos Mori, have done some research in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, monitoring the experience and behaviours of consumers when it comes to key food risks during the pandemic. And what that's actually done is it's called out a huge amount of information and data about what consumers are thinking about food at the moment. And this data was collected both in April and May, and they're going to rerun the survey both in June and July. So we'll get a further cut of the information probably into August. But the key takeouts I think are really interesting. First of all, since lockdown, there's been a continued trend towards more localised food purchasing behaviours, particularly when it comes to people purchasing veg boxes and food from farm shops, and 35% say they're going to do that more often. And that reflects back on the conversation we had with Vince, wasn't it, 2 shows ago, about how independent bakers are doing and independent butchers, and how possible it will be to keep some of those consumers sticking and remaining shopping locally, rather than just going back to the supermarkets when that's more easy to do and people are back at work. The second stat in the survey, it shows that people say they're wasting less food and eating together more as a family, and naturally we would be doing that because of the food service being closed. But I think that waste point's really interesting, and we're seeing more and more data coming out about people wasting less. And one of the things it talks about in the article is people are braver to eat food that's gone past its use-by date, ranging from smoked fish, 17% are saying that they'll brave that, and bagged salads, 36% of people will brave something that passed a use-by date. And maybe, in the past you think, oh, well, I'll just drop that in the bin because I'm popping to the supermarket tomorrow. But because our frequency has reduced, then people are trying to reduce any waste. Picking up on our takeaways conversation just now, the data showing in this report that people are buying fewer takeaways overall when compared before lockdown. And naturally some of that is because of the availability and there's not as many takeaways open maybe. But it also calls out food safety, food hygiene and financial reasons, and the increased cooking at home is stopping people getting so many takeaways, but it also says, because it's done a full cut of 16 to 75-year-olds in the survey, younger people say they're buying more takeaways. And it doesn't give much data behind that, but something that was in the back of my mind is that because the repertoire of meals that the younger generation is able to cook is more limited? I'm not sure, but we've seen over the last couple of decades home economics coming off some of the curriculums. This has been a real challenge for people to be able to cook a variation. So actually, has that driven more into the takeaway option? And then finally, unsurprisingly, as we've spoken about pretty much for the last 10 weeks, online food purchasing remains high, whether in relation to supermarkets or food ordering apps. So there was nothing groundbreaking in the survey, but I think it's really good to cement our views and what we've been picking up, and actually seeing what's going to stick, particularly that shopping local point. What were your thoughts?
I agree. I think it's really important for us to have trackers that look at how consumer sentiment evolves throughout the outbreak, but also beyond. I mean, I can't wait to see the second tranche of that data. That to me is actually the most interesting bit, because, as you say, I think it's good to get some data around how consumers behaved in April and May, but in a way that feels like a lifetime ago already. We were still in the sort of throes of the lockdown then. And I would say the data that's come out there from the FSA does largely echo, I think, findings that we have seen from quite a few people already. I mean, I can think of a fairly extensive survey from WRAP around food waste attitudes that, picked up that reduction in food waste in the home quite early on. So I think it's confirmation, and it's sort of helping us to kind of lock in some of those key themes. Now that they're doing this on an ongoing basis, though, I think the data is going to be fascinating to watch, because we're going to see how much of that new behaviour is actually going to stick. There's always one thing to ask people whether they expect to stick with a certain behaviour in the future. It's quite another thing to then ask in 2 months or 3 months' time to see how many have actually done that. So I'll be very interested to see what comes out when they publish the next wave of the data.
What's your final pick?
My final pick this week is taking us into space. It's an article from The Spoon. It's called "Up Next for the Astronaut's Diet: Space Peppers." It's a great piece, really interesting, written by Jennifer Marston. It's a story about the Space Crop Production Lab at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, where they're researching how to grow chili peppers in space. That probably sounds reasonably extravagant, but there's a fairly good reason for why you might want to do that. Largely, they are looking at ways to supply astronauts with fresher, higher quality food on their space missions. And chilies are a good starting point for that effort, because they can add vitamins to whatever packaged foods, rehydrated foods astronauts might be consuming, but they also add some much needed flavour. And one of the big challenges that they are facing, the scientists are facing, is figuring out how to water plants in a zero gravity environment. But they have found a solution that seems to work. The system they have developed is called a passive porous tube nutrient delivery system. It's very catchy. But essentially what it does is it forces the water upwards to water the plants, which means it's much more suitable for a zero gravity environment. I love this story. I think it's really interesting, just the fact that it exists. I didn't know the Space Crop Production Lab existed, but I'm very excited to find out that it does. But what I thought was really interesting actually here is that this isn't just about better diets for astronauts. This isn't just about space travel. It's also about potentially finding some commercial applications from this research that could help growers more widely, not just those people trying to grow chili peppers or other produce in space. And this watering system that they've developed is an example where they reckon it could actually come in really handy on vertical farms, because it could help reach those hard to reach upper levels where, sometimes growers struggle to get sufficient water to. And there's a bit more interest around space travel more generally at the moment. So we're probably likely to see more research efforts to, develop new ways to keep astronauts well fed on their missions. But I'm particularly excited to see how much of that kind of space research is ultimately going to result in some really exciting commercial applications that are going to make a difference to how we grow produce here on Earth as well. What did you make of it? Did you know of the Space Crop Production Lab?
I didn't, and I felt bad because I have been to the Kennedy Space Centre a long time ago, and it wasn't. I didn't. I'm going to admit I didn't really enjoy it because there wasn't much to see at that time. So I think
you missed the chili peppers.
I missed the chili peppers. That was the problem. If the chili peppers were there, so I was intrigued by the article and I enjoyed it. And I have to admit, it did make me think about the likes of Marks and Spencer's doing more theatre in store about growing herbs and crops and that sort of thing. And will that be in time, as you say, take on a domestic and even potentially a retail slant that folks will look at this watering?
What's your final pick this week?
My final pick is from the BBC, and it's Starbucks suspends social media ads over hate speech. And this is the fact that Starbucks has announced it will suspend advertising on some social media platforms in response to hate speech. And this is following in the steps of Coca-Cola, Diageo and Unilever, which have recently removed advertising from social media platforms. This is all around the fact that there's concern by some of these major FMCG manufacturers that they're paying for advertising on predominantly Facebook and Instagram platforms, and they haven't necessarily got control about the content that is around their adverts. So right at the bottom of the article, it gives a bit of context in terms of the growth. Facebook reported a 27% increase in advertising revenue over the previous years. And the controversies around Facebook's approach to moderating some of this content on its platform, and it's been seen to be too hands-off. This is absolutely fascinating because it's pulling some of these FMCG brands into a space now where it can't avoid getting involved in politics, in campaigns. If some of the platforms and the social media platforms such as Facebook don't take a stronger account on this, then it will challenge their advertising revenue, and the big brands don't want to be affiliated with it at the moment. Social media has been a huge opportunity to connect with audiences that no longer necessarily watch TV or use a traditional promotional channels. But what that does have for it, the traditional channels, is you can share with your advertiser what the content's going to be that you're going to be butted up next to, and you don't have the danger of having a screenshot of some content with a paid for ad of a big brand next to something that actually is content which some may find shouldn't be on there and shouldn't be for public consumption.
The debate around how these social media platforms have a responsibility, to what extent they have a responsibility to try and moderate content on their platforms, I think is a hugely thorny issue. I mean, Facebook, companies like Facebook are investing in thousands of moderators, but you are looking at a deluge of content. There's obviously a wider challenge, which is that a lot of these platforms reject the premise that they should be responsible for moderating something, because it then takes them into a rather different sphere of media, and it takes them into a rather different business model as well. You're right, I don't think it's going to go away, and clearly the pressure on Facebook in particular has been mounting. Advertisers, I think, have an important role to play in all of this, and I think it's interesting to see some of the names there. I mean, I wasn't surprised, for instance, to see Unilever in there. Ben & Jerry's, I think, were one of the first sort of more high-profile brands in the US to come out and sort of publicly state that they were pausing advertising on that. These brands have huge budgets to spend, and they're very important customers of Facebook, of Instagram, of those platforms. So they can make a big difference if they choose to do so.
But as you say, the skill to try and moderate it is so challenging if it's got to have human eyes rather than artificial intelligence.
Quite possibly. But at the same time, I think if that is your business and you have created a business of huge scale and you make a lot of money, I don't think the fact that it's difficult should let you off the hook. Yes, it's absolutely true that the scale is enormous and it's not going to be easy to fix that. But these are very big businesses. They have a huge reach. I think they also have a huge responsibility. And part of that may well be around taking a tougher stance on moderating content.
Fascinating as ever.
So lovely catching up with you.
It's great, and look forward to catching up next week with a guest.
Absolutely. All right, see you then.
Bye.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.